Okay, so for this talk, what I'll be doing is essentially going through the First Crusade. I can't do all the Crusades. I do the First Crusade because it's kind of the genesis of the notion. It's the first time that it's done. Crusade occurs in a formal way, and it sets the foundation for what we understand the Crusades are, and what they meant and what happened. So the first half is I'll do a very quick, hopefully only 20 minutes or less, go through what happened in the First Crusade. I don't know if anyone here has studied medieval history at university. Some of you who have might have gone through this already, or you'll know some of the background already. So just bear with me. For everyone else, it's often an interesting kind of rehash of what you might have learnt or not been taught very well at school. And I think it's important that we go through this period of history because it's a very important part of our heritage as Catholics. It's an important part of our heritage as human beings, of course. And this is one of the topics that there's a lot of negativity about this in the Catholic Church. And a lot of that is misplaced or misguided, which we find often. So that's the first part. I'll go through the history, and the second part I'll kind of reel off a couple of common myths about the First Crusade, and then you might have some of your own questions. So I'm going to start with the Mediterranean at the time before the Middle Ages kind of begins. There's always arguments about when the Middle Ages begins. Nothing's ever set in stone in history, but it's generally when the Western Roman Empire kind of slowly crumbled through barbarian invasions. And we can see here it started to do that already in 450. We're right into the post Western Roman period. Just to quickly backtrack, you might know that the Roman Empire was split in half in the later part of its life because it was just becoming too big to operate. And the famous Emperor Constantine, he was the emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire, based around Constantinople, which is named after him. That was originally known as Byzantium, and we'll have a look at that in the map soon. So when I say the word Byzantine, that refers to this part of the Roman Empire that existed well up into the 15th century in various forms. So Byzantine refers to the Eastern Roman Empire as it develops. Whereas the Western Roman Empire, you can see here, we've got the Hunnic invasions in the north. You've got the emergence of various what traditionally is known as barbarian kingdoms, and that develops even further. So I'm going to jump to where that develops, but I'm also going to start here at the spread of Islam. So a few hundred years later, we have the beginning of Islam, and we can see the purple area is the Byzantine Empire. So it has moved into some territories for a time that were part of the Western Roman Empire, because that Western Roman Empire had developed into kind of the early version of modern Europe today, where there's a variety of number of different kingdoms and countries, and it's not one big empire. You can see the Franks, very important. So the French have established their kingdom. You have the Visigoths, who are Christian too now, and they take over Iberia or Spain. But Islam is very small. And you have the Persians here. Okay, Islam is very small. Now, Islam spreads extremely quickly, spreads by military force, and that's just only a couple of years later. So how many years we got there? Go from 624 to 670. Okay, so it spreads very quickly, spreads east very quickly. It goes right through North Africa, and again, it spreads even further. And if you look, for our purposes as to perhaps why people went on crusade, have a look up here. The entirety of Spain is conquered under Mohammedan control, and they venture into southern France, and that's the Battle of Poitiers there, where they are defeated and they don't get any further, even though they had to try for the next couple of 100 years. And then, so that's kind of the situation on the lead up to the Crusades. Now, the First Crusade happens starts in 1095, so we're still a couple of 100 years before that. And a couple of things have happened worth listing before the First Crusade. When it comes to Islamic attack on the West, and I've listed a couple of here. So the conquest of Jerusalem, and that's Jerusalem's an important city under the control of the Byzantines, and that's conquered in 637 AD, and Jerusalem is controlled by Islamic rulers since then. We've got the Umaid, that's a certain kind of branch of Islam, a certain tribe, to put it that way. The Umaid conquest of the Iberian Peninsula, that's Spain, which I just spoke about, and the Battle of Covadonga in 722 AD. I'm very good at pronouncing other languages with an Aussie accent, so please bear with me, those of you who can speak Spanish. The Battle of Tours, I said Poitiers before, sorry, I meant the Battle of Tours. Now that's right in France, the Battle of Tours, and it's a defeat of the Muslim armies, but it's a very, very major battle. And if it wasn't a defeat, you know, our mind can imagine how much further they would have gone into Europe. The conquest of Sicily is also very important, and we know that's at the bottom of Italy. Conquering Sicily and parts of the Mediterranean gives, I'll use the word Saracen because that's some of the words they used in the Middle Ages. That's another word for kind of Muslim soldiers. Saracen ability to send ships all throughout Italy, up the coast of Italy, and attack. And they actually sacked St. Peter's Basilica, which is outside the walls of the medieval city, the old city, in 846 AD. That's one of the many attacks that they make upon Italian Catholics during this period. So that's kind of the very short example of what's happening in Europe. If we go back to Spain, Spain over a long period of time before the First Crusade and afterwards continues to fight who they call the Moors, who are the Islamic conquerors, and that's a 900-year war. So this is going on as well. So during the Crusades, it's actually a type of crusade. So that's an example of what happened in Europe. The Battle of Manzikert is very important, and I'll bring up a map. Hopefully that's next. Yep, you can see it just here. And that's one of the major defeats of the Byzantines. So the Byzantines, as we remember, kind of controlled various parts of the Mediterranean, and a lot of that was taken by the Muslim armies. And what we have here is a number of, you can see the dates there, a number of major defeats of the Byzantine armies by a new tribe who had converted to Islam called the Turks, which come from this area of Asia Minor, and they had become Muslim and were very, very passionate about spreading the faith and their own empire, to put it that way. And there are a variety of different groups in Islam, even at this fairly early stage. So during the time of the Crusades, you had mainly the Egyptians who controlled this area, and then the Turks. And the Battle of Manzikert is a huge problem because the Byzantines are heavily defeated, and they can no longer, in their opinion, defend this area here. and they retreat all the way to Constantinople. And so you have Islamic armies and Islamic control right up to the Bosphorus here, which is right near Constantinople. Now we know in the end, in the 15th century, Constantinople becomes Istanbul, and it's conquered. But at this stage, it's a new threat that's been rising and rising and slowly come to the fore. So that's the battle up to the Battle of Manzikert. Now, I'm sorry if I'm going too quickly. Rita, you tell me if I'm going too quickly. You have heard this talk before, but anyway, I'll go back to Europe here. So this is Europe just before the First Crusade. You can see the Byzantine Empire is greatly diminished. You got the Seljuks, or the Turks. The Armenians are holding out. I won't talk much about the Armenians, but they hold out, and they hold out for a long, long time. The rest of Europe, if you can see, is divided into lots of different small kingdoms. So this is the Middle Ages, the time of monasteries and knights and crusades and cathedrals and universities and all these things that we associate with the Middle Ages. It's a whole nother talk, about how the Middle Ages was a great pinnacle, one of the great pinnacles of human civilization, not this kind of the common view that it's full of people who are ignorant and were oppressed by the church and all these kind of things. I mean, I won't be going into that, but you'll get a sense of why that might be a bit wrong during this talk. But that's a talk for another time. But there we are, Europe in 1092. The First Crusade is called in 1095. So we're right on the cusp of the First Crusade. But I won't go to the next slide yet. But when we're talking about crusade, we're talking about what happens is that there's a rise in a feeling in Europe that something must be done about the constant attacks that are happening to Christians in the Mediterranean and in Europe. And it's not, let's wake up one morning and go for a wander and attack some Muslims. It's actually a reaction. That's kind of the setting the scene. But internally, we have this notion of holy war. I use the word holy war. Just war is another way to use it. But this one, I think crusading has a particular edge. And you have a variety of influences. Augustine talks, I won't go into all the details, but Augustine, who's much earlier, he talks about the just use of force as an act of love. And in this context, we're talking about as a love of neighbour, as an overarching notion of love for what is right and what is good, and defending the innocent and defending the church and its members. Aquinas develops the notion of just war much later on, and I'm sure Father Laurie will be happy to take you through that if you ever want to talk to him about it. But I also want to, I just wrote in here the medieval view. So the medieval, one thing I really need to emphasize is that we need to understand the context in which people are living in this period. I mean, if the Muslims invade, you don't call the United Nations and get a sanction against them. I mean, there's no such thing. If you want to be safe, you need to be able to fight and defend yourself, whether you're a peasant or whether you're a knight or whether you're a pope or a bishop or a monastery. You need to be able to defend yourself. Europe had gone through huge upheaval with barbarian invasions, and then you have Magyar invasions, you have the Huns, you have Vikings. Time after time, Christianity seemed, when these groups become Christian, they tone down their violence, but it's still a very violent period. We've institutionalized in Australia, so the reason I can sit in my house, one of the reasons anyway, I can sit in my house and give a talk over Zoom, is because Australia has armed forces that protect me. and we pay for that via our taxes. So sometimes we forget that we live in a similar kind of basic situation, because it's much more professionalized now, I suppose. So we have to kind of understand that it's not about, oh, someone stole my sheep, I'm going to call the police. There are no police. It's a very different world, and that's the world that most humans have lived in all throughout history. So we're very lucky in some respects, though often I don't know if the police would find the sheep that was stolen from me. But that's one understanding. The second understanding is that we are also in a post-Enlightenment civilization where religion is, even in our own lives, sometimes religion's an added extra. It's something that we do, and we all have various different religions, and at best it's considered a good thing. We're very passionate about it, but this is not the life of anybody in the entire world. I would say in this period, or in most people who've lived on the planet. Religion is part and parcel of everything you do. It is a very important aspect of day-to-day life. So religious problems are not things that priests and bishops just sort out. It's something that everybody is affected by and has their own connection to. So that's really important understanding of human history and the Middle Ages and how it's different from us to us. And often you get, oh, well, how dare they behave that way? Why didn't they just turn the other cheek or do this or the other? I mean, you could make those arguments, but it's very easy for us in a very organized, simple in many ways society we live in when it comes to these kind of things to be a bit confused when we look at the Middle Ages. So anyway, that's a little rant, but hopefully it's helpful. This is my definition of what the concept was for the First Crusade and the Crusades following. And I'll read it out. It's written there for you. An act of charity in defense of Christ's body, whether manifest in Christian individuals, Christian states, peoples, or church institutions. And things like the papacy, sacramentals and relics of church buildings themselves have a very, very important place in the religious life of Catholics during this period. And I say in union with the perceived will of Christ. I put the word perceived in there because we can always argue whether it was in line with what Christ wanted or not. I mean, I'm not going to go into that. It was, I believe it was papally sanctioned and things like that. But that's the definition. So the Crusaders and crusading was fundamentally seen as act of charity, a giving of oneself in a particular military way to the defense of Christianity. So this is, after a bit of study, this is kind of my definition of where we landed for the First Crusade. Now, how did they end up deciding, well, we're going to go on crusade today and on this given time? So what happens is that Pope Blessed Urban II, at a church council in Clermont in France, he decides to preach also at the end of this council the First Crusade. And it's very important to note that he did it during this church council, because there's a long period of reform of the church and society going on in this period, and the Crusades can't be seen in isolation. And what we were talking about is, what is the role of a knight in a Christian society? It's to defend the weak, defend the innocent, not to attack each other, not to steal land from each other and things like that. And so there we have the papal precedents and church reform. These were organized into notions of the peace and truth of God. So no fighting on certain days, keep holy days not for fighting and things like that. Sounds a bit funny to us, but back then that was quite pacifist and quite a new thing. If you think of a whole civilization of kind of converted Vikings being told not to fight all the time, that's a pretty big deal. It's like, converting a group of bikies and telling them not to fight or something. You got the three orders, which is this notion that there's the knightly class, there's the church class, and then there's the you'd probably call them the peasants at school these days, but you'd call them the landowners and the villagers and the workers. There are three kind of basic orders of society, and the knights are in charge of defending them. We also have something that's really important up the top: constant Islamic threats. I probably don't need to go over that anymore. And the unification with the East. So we have a situation where the church had split down the lines of the old Roman Empire, and the Eastern Church had broken from Rome. Constantinople thought it would go it alone, or they thought that Rome would go it alone. And that split, unfortunately, still exists. But there's been numerous times when that has been healed, and the Crusades is an example of that. And it's very formal, sending soldiers to go and assist the Byzantines to re-establish control over Palestine and the Holy Land, and allow them to once again rule as Christian rulers and return Christian practice and Christian control to these areas. And it was one of the things the Pope was trying to do, and was quite well received in many ways with the East in an ecclesiastical sense. One final thing, there was also a very strong sense of ecclesiastical liberty again on the rise. In other words, that it is not good for monasteries and churches to be under the control of the complete control of lay people. That the church should be free to preach and to do what it needs to do without the local duke or the local king trying to control it. That's a common thing in the Middle Ages that had to be dealt with. Okay, I am going a lot longer already than I expected, but I'll keep going. So we also have this one single line which we know is sums up what the Pope called for. We have records of his speech, which are quite good, but you have their second-hand and third-hand accounts. But we have this canon. So you heard of Canon Law, a written down piece of legislation from the Council of Clermont about the Crusades, and you've probably read it while I'm talking. Whoever for devotion alone, not to obtain honour or money, shall set out to free the Church of God at Jerusalem, they shall be counted to him for all penance. So that's Pope Urban saying this is you're to go on crusade for devotion and not to obtain honour and money, not to enrich yourself or become lords of Holy Land. And that is a pilgrimage, it's a penitential act that goes towards the penances that you've been given. And it's the first example that my understanding of a plenary indulgence in the history of the church. I won't go into plenary indulgences, but it's the whole notion of a pious act being given papal approval as being very spiritually efficacious in a broad sense. Again, Father Laurie, I'm sure will sit you down and talk to you about plenary indulgences if you need. I'm sure Rita and Jess could do the same too. Anyway, so let's get into the actual crusade. Urban II's the Pope who calls it. He appoints Bishop Adhemar of Le Puy as his legate, so his representative, the leader of the crusade. We have Alexios Komnenos, and he's the Byzantine emperor at the time, and he had actually sent over a number of years requests for help to the Pope, requests for military assistance. So that's one thing that's really important. The crusade fundamentally was a response to a request from the Byzantine emperor for help. Alexios sends Tacticos as a Byzantine general and observer with the Crusaders. He doesn't send his troops straight away. He's very nervous about the Battle of Manzikert, and if he gets all these troops together and goes out, once again they're defeated, Constantinople is completely undefended. So he doesn't send troops, but he sends a general and a small detachment. And then we have the Turks, which I spoke about, and the Fatimids. They're the two Islamic groups that we encounter on the First Crusade. From the Western side of things, there's a whole variety of different leaders. dukes and barons who joined the First Crusade. Raymond of Toulouse, he's one of the most powerful. He's already fought to assist the Spanish against the Moors. Toulouse is in southern France. A lot of the kind of crusading, the idea of going on crusade and pilgrimage, armed pilgrimage to Jerusalem comes from around this area. We've got Bohemond of Taranto and Tancred, and they're both Normans. Now, you might know that a Norman is essentially a Viking who has settled a few hundred years ago in Europe. Very, very warlike. Christians, of course, had become Christians quite some time ago. And the Normans had been very close to the previous popes in defending those popes against those who would want to take control of the papacy. Bohemond, of course, he's a bit of a naughty boy, I think. He had waged war against the Byzantine emperor as well before, but he had a change of heart. We have Godfrey de Bouillon. He's another very powerful French duke. Robert of Normandy, his brother is very famous, that his brother is William the Conqueror. So this is, 1095 is not much later than 1066, where the Normans defeated the Anglo-Saxons and conquered England. So there's a bit of a connection there. Another Norman. Stephen of Blois, you'll hear about him. And there's a whole variety of others. So you see a lot of these are French. The French are the first people to take up the cause, but it quickly spreads, particularly to Italy and other places. And as they're on crusade, there's still more and more waves of crusaders joining them from all over the place. They set out. Oh, here's I know some people want to see some of the fun and games. Very heavily armored soldiers, the Crusaders. This, you can see this fellow here, big shield, chain mail, very good armor for the time, very powerful. They're knights on horseback, extremely difficult blokes to kill. This bloke is a little bit later, 13th century. He's a Crusader. He's just come home for a big night at the pub, it looks like. Pretty excited about his new job. And here's a Byzantine soldier. Just to kind of give you the Byzantines, similar type of armor, but not as heavily armored. But the Crusaders were famous for their knights on horseback and the power of their lance. There's a lot of study being done on that, on how powerful their charge was. I can't go on and on with the time we've got. Here's kind of some more Easternized Crusaders. Italians, and some Byzantines as well. So you get a sense of their weaponry. And here's the Turks. The Turks were very much lightly armored, mainly lightly armored horse archers, as opposed to heavily armored knights, and that makes a difference in some of the battles. And here's an example. So the Turkish cavalry is very quick, very flexible, but the Frankish, often the term they used for Crusaders, the Frankish warriors were very, very strong and were able to defend themselves quite well against the horse archers, even when heavily outnumbered. And here we have the Fatimids, and these are the Egyptians. They still have a very much more lightly armored, faster moving military style, but they're a little bit more heavily armored and less horse archers, put it that way. So those of you who are interested, there's a lot of work done on medieval and Crusader warfare particularly, and it might be of interest to you. Okay, map of the First Crusade. So the red lines are the various Crusaders and groups, and who they leave and they arrive in Constantinople in 1097, and the Emperor of Constantinople is very keen to get this huge army away from Constantinople, and the reason being is, regardless of how well oriented and the ideals of the Crusader and the Crusader armies, they're very, very difficult to control. The army gets very hungry, very difficult. So you got to keep moving, and you kind of have to feed yourself on the run as you go. And that's where you get the whole notion of besieging a city and then kind of people going a bit crazy and sacking it. Well, they're trying to get themselves, keep themselves alive as an army. And the Crusades is full of that kind of difficulty. In some instances, the Crusader army just almost dies of starvation because they just don't have food. So the Emperor of Constantinople, very happy for the help, but off you go. Cross the water and try your hand at Nicaea. Now let me have a look. So I'm just making sure my slides are right. Yep. So they conquer Nicaea, and Nicaea is where the Nicene Creed was kind of formalized, and they besieged the city, and the city surrenders, but it doesn't surrender to the Crusaders because it's worried the Crusaders will want to feed themselves and kind of use the kind of more Western notion of we're allowed to come in and take all your valuables, and instead they surrender to the Byzantines. There's a lot of historical argument about whether actually they were meant to always surrender to the Byzantines because the Crusaders had sworn allegiance to the Byzantine emperor. So anyway, we can go. Anybody interested can chase me up on that argument. So Nicaea surrenders to the Byzantine Empire. It's the first victory. But then they're marching to Antioch. They get attacked by the Turks at Dorylaeum, and it's almost a Crusader defeat. The Crusaders had split into two groups. One group is being heavily attacked by horse archers, their flanks exposed, but what they do is they pitch all these tents along one flank, and that very simple tactic stops the horse archers being able to ride through and get close enough to shoot arrows at them, and then they're able to defend themselves. And then the other branch of the army arrives, and the Turks are defeated again. So that you see this here, this ingenuity of the Crusaders in a very, very weird environment to what they're used to, and they're able to repel an enormous, and we're talking about enormous disproportion in numbers. Crusaders are usually outnumbered 10, 20 to 1 in any battle. And then they move to Antioch, and then you can see here they get to Jerusalem, and they also conquer Edessa tactically to defend themselves. Antioch's a really important battle. Siege, they arrive at Antioch as an enormous old Byzantine and old Roman city, now under the control of the Turks. They besiege it for a long time. They're attacked by Turks from other cities while they're besieging Antioch. They're kind of stuck in the middle for a number of instances, and then they're helped by this group of people you might have heard of. They're called Maronites. I have heard of Maronites, and they're very helpful. It's actually, I think it's one of the first times in Western writing that you hear the word Maronite for many, many centuries. And they're living and practicing Christianity under Islamic control in Antioch, and they assist. And one of the ways they assist is by letting the Crusaders in. So the Crusaders are let in at night one day, and Raymond of Toulouse's troops particularly, they take the city, and that's a great victory. Interestingly, they always install the local Byzantine bishop to be bishop of that city, and that's a sign of the desire for this to be a unifying of East and West going on at the time. But a few things happen in Antioch that really set the scene for the Crusades for the rest of history. One is that once they're inside the city, they're besieged by an enormous army themselves, and they still haven't taken all the city. So there's a large fortified part of Antioch that's still under the control of the Turks. An enormous Turkish army surrounds them, and they're starting to starve and all the things that happen to you when you're being besieged like that. And the Byzantine general Tacticos, he thinks it's all over. This is another battle of Manzikert. I'm out of here, and he escapes. And Stephen of Blois, who you might have remembered, he escapes as well, and he meets the emperor of Byzantium on the way to Antioch with a huge army and says it's all over, it's just a disaster. And the emperor finds out that he thinks that this is true, and immediately thinks, well, I'm exposed with my army out here, I've got to go back to Antioch. So the Byzantine Empire essentially withdraws from the Crusades, and that's when we get the kind of Crusaders having to go it alone. They no longer feel as though the Byzantine Empire is there to help them, and that's why you get the Crusader States as opposed to the re-establishment of the Byzantine Empire. If that hadn't have happened, I'm of the firm belief that the whole history of the Middle East, of the Levant, of Palestine, and the Holy Land would be completely different. And we would, so it's, we can only kind of think about what would have happened, but that's the idea. Stephen of Blois goes home. Soon after he goes home, the story comes back that the Crusaders were successful. His wife's very, very annoyed at him, bringing shame on the family, and sends him back, and he dies on the way. So just do as you're told the first time, guys. So eventually the Crusaders decide to do a frontal attack upon the Turkish army. Huge numbers against them, but they managed to defeat the Turks. Historians don't understand how this happened at all. There's no real explanation for it. For those interested, the written accounts of what happened was that there was divine intervention. There were visions in the sky of St. George and a whole variety of St. Michael. I mean, either way, whatever you believe, it was a remarkable victory. And Antioch became a very strong and very important part of the Crusader holdings in that area, because it's such a big and important city. It's connected to the Mediterranean and affects the whole area around it. After that, it's pretty easy for the Crusaders to get all the way to Jerusalem. Most of the towns and cities surrender. They know that they've conquered Antioch, and there's not much way to defeat them, to defend against them, and it's fairly peaceful. You get to Jerusalem. Now, Jerusalem is not under the control of the Turks. It's under the control of the Fatimids. And the Fatimids, I think they can do better than the Turks. And there's a long siege. And you have very protracted siege. We have what we know as siege engines or catapults brought up by Genoese sailors who have joined the Crusades from the coast, and they construct trebuchets. And you can see some versions of them here. Later on, by the way, I think it's pretty funny. Later on, when Richard the Lionheart was I think it was Richard Lionheart, he had some trebuchets. A few hundred years later, he had one he named Bad Neighbor, and the other one he called God's Own Sling. So I mean, they had a sense of humor, but that's later on. So we have this is the kind of warfare that's being conducted, full-blown siege warfare, where instead of in Antioch, where they're helped out by some friendly locals, they don't have any that they know here, and they take it via breaking through the walls, having siege towers as well. So some of you might have played Age of Empires or studied history and know how these work, but they wheel them up to the wall, and there's a drawbridge go down. There's a big battle here to see if you can take some of the wall. This is very traditional medieval warfare, and they managed to conquer Jerusalem, and that is a huge battle. There is a lot of violence in Jerusalem when it happens. The Jerusalem is sacked, which is unfortunate, but there are some mitigating factors which I might talk about. And you have the establishment of the Crusader States, and here they are. So the Kingdom of Jerusalem the county of Tripoli, and the Principality of Antioch, and the county of Edessa. And then the Armenians are freed to be in control of Armenia. Now, in the end, this is not what we'd recognise as a map of the Middle East, because we know that over hundreds of years, the Islamic empires united. They defeated the Crusaders, and most of the Crusades were failures. The First Crusade was very successful, but for whatever reason, my opinion is because of the difficulty with the Byzantine Empire, it didn't remain. But that's a whole nother story, and I can't keep going on about that. So there we have it. We have the establishment of military orders, which some of you might have heard of. So whole religious orders dedicated to fighting for and defending Christianity, and some of them have become very, very powerful. These guys invent hospitals that we're used to. By the way, they invent international banking, a whole variety of things. It's really important. But I might move on to some myths for 10 minutes, if that's okay, and then I have some questions. Is that all right, guys? Okay, so this is one of the myths you hear. The Crusades were wars of unprovoked aggression against a peaceful Muslim world. I mean, that's not true. I think anyone who's listened to my talk get a sense of that not being true. I'm not saying that every single Muslim was aggressive. There were periods of peace between the Umayyads and the Spanish. There were periods of peace all throughout the long story of Christianity and Islam. But any notion that, which is often put out there, that the West, the Pope just woke up one day and decided, let's go and kill some Muslims, is demonstrably false. This very, very clearly was an organized defensive action. It was a bit of a reconquest, linked to religious notions of kindness and love of one's neighbour. So you just go through the history, and I don't think anyone can agree with that. That's one of the myths. So next myth. The Crusaders were only interested in capturing booty and land. Their religious activities were just a cover for greed and a lust for wealth. Now, there are, of course, I referred to their desire to sack cities. I think I've explained, at least briefly, why they did that. We also have the evidence against this is from the Pope's very own proclamation of the Crusade, where he says that that's not the reason you ought to go. We also have piles and piles of original legal documents from Crusaders getting their affairs in order to leave the Crusade, and they say why they go. And they say they're going for the grace of the pilgrimage. They're going to support fellow Christians. They're going to do God's will. Then none of them say, I'm going to get rich. And lastly, none of them did get rich. Perhaps Balma of Taranto was out to become a ruler over there, and Raymond of Toulouse, he remained over there as a local ruler. But these guys didn't remain local rulers because they wanted to get more wealthy than they were. These guys were serious landowners and barons. They stayed there because they felt like it was their duty to do so. And most Crusaders went home afterwards. They went on, this is a pilgrimage to them, and they went on pilgrimage and they came home, and most of them actually were impoverished. Robert of Normandy dies in a debtor's prison because he can't pay for the crusade. So this is once again it's just not based on historical evidence at all. The Crusaders were just a way for the landless younger sons of nobles to have something to do. So this is one of the stories out there. Oh, they went on crusade because they had all these second sons who wouldn't inherit the kingdom or the duchy or the castle, so they went off to find their own little patch of land. It's not true. It's kind of linked to that the myth just beforehand. most of the Crusaders weren't second sons. They were major landowners in their own right. Their soldiers and their participants weren't people who were looking for something to do. They were people who really believed in what they were doing. Some of them had parents and grandparents who fought against Islamic invasions in their own backyard. So historical evidence again doesn't stack up for this one. The Pope used the Crusaders to gain control of the Church of Rome. I've heard that one. Actually, I put that in there because giving this talk many years ago, someone claimed that happened. It didn't happen. Having control of Rome, the Pope having control of Rome, it goes back to my comments earlier about the Pope is kicked out of Rome. He doesn't call the police to get reinstalled. He doesn't call the United Nations, or the Americans don't drop him off in a drone. We're talking realistically here. The popes did have armies. They had their own. Sometimes they had their own way of defending themselves and their churches and their property. But the Crusaders, there is maybe some evidence that the Pope travelled back to parts of Rome with the Crusaders at the time. I mean, I would have too if I wanted to be protected. But the Crusaders go to Rome and on pilgrimage, and they don't attack it. Urban II at the time doesn't have control of Rome. There's an anti-pope there. I can't remember his name. It was very common to have another person claim to be pope all throughout history. We're very lucky at the moment, the last couple of hundred years, not to have that problem. But there is no historical evidence that these Crusaders helped the Pope conquer Rome. It just didn't happen, plain and simple. The Crusaders wanted to convert Muslims to Christianity. Well, once again, that didn't happen. There's no evidence of Crusaders widespread wanting to convert Muslims to Christianity, and that's one of the great myths, that the Islamic people were minding their own business, doing their own thing, and then these rabid Christians came to kill them, convert or die. Doesn't happen. Might have happened in very, very minor circumstances. I'm not aware of any evidence of it. This was all more of a political situation where the Christians wanted to stop Islamic attacks, wanted to free the Middle East and particularly the Holy Land from Islamic control, so they could be free to worship and live as Christians there. This is what happened. Forced conversions are very, very uncommon throughout the history of the Crusades. Not in the opposite direction, however. Muslims are very good at forcing Christians to convert. Not always, but quite often. That's next. Now here's a difficult one. When the Crusaders captured Jerusalem, and I alluded to this, in 1099 they massacred every man, woman, and child in the city till the streets ran ankle deep with their blood. Yes, they did sack the city, and yes, it's a horrible thing in war when this happens. The Crusaders may have made a mistake in regards to, however, the reality of the streets running ankle deep with their blood, and I think sometimes they say even knee deep. I mean, there's not enough people. There weren't enough people living in Jerusalem if they all died and were killed, that there would not be enough blood. This is hyperbole. It's a poetic license by people at the time. They did not massacre every man, woman, and child, but they were very, very scared of what happened in Antioch happening again, where they conquer a city and they're immediately besieged by attacked from within and besieged from without. And so, and they were right, because not long after the Fatimids did attack Jerusalem, they were met at the Battle of Ascalon, and they were defeated by the Crusaders, but only because they were aware of the problem that could arise. Fighting is difficult. Fighting is horrible. It's always considered an evil when it comes to it's always considered part of our concupiscence, I'd say. So it's derives, this whole situation's derived from concupiscence. So I'm not defending any notion of a massacre, but there are questions about the massacre and whether it really happened as a way, as some people claim that it did. It's more likely to have been a military situation where they were either have to get rid of threats or they're gone. Yep. How's my time going? I'll do two more. The Crusades were just medieval colonialism dressed up in religious finery. Well, the answer is no. There was no desire to conquer Mecca or places like this. This was a re-colonization. I've kind of gone over this one, but I will say this. One of the reasons the Crusades get such a bad rap is because in a later period, for no historical reason, the Crusades was talked about as a great example of Christian, the first example of Christian colonialism, to support kind of British colonialism and things like that. And then of course, when British colonialism becomes something that is not considered a good thing, then, well, crusading is an example of how horrible that is, when really crusading was never colonialism in the first place. It's often was the liberation of Aboriginal inhabitants of these areas, the Maronites being an example. So that's another myth that's not true. Yes, it was, however, a religious war. So yes, it was religious, but it was not colonialism. Crusaders believed that killing Muslims would get them to heaven. No. Going and killing a Muslim was not going to get you to heaven. It was a very formalized notion of remittance of penance for participating in an armed pilgrimage. Armed pilgrimage can involve and did involve fighting and killing, but it wasn't kind of this rabid notion, oh, I'll go and kill. The more Muslims I kill, the more likely I'll go to heaven. I mean, that's just, Christianity has never had that idea, and that was not part of the Crusades at all. There's a few other ideas, but we can talk about those in question time. So I'm happy to go to questions now. I've never done this kind of thing before.
I've got a question from Andreas. So
Yep,
maybe do you want to stop sharing, Dan?
Yeah. How do I? Sorry, I'll just stop sharing.
Yeah.
Stop sharing. There we go.
That's it. So Andreas, do you want to go?
Yeah, 1 second. First, Daniel, thank you for your talk. I appreciated the talk, but I would like to know, like, it's rather than a question, it's like more your kind of an opinion that I have. Like, I think that like people's distaste for the Crusades comes from like several first-hand sources. Like Full Church of Chartres, who talks about like in Gesta Francorum about like what the Crusaders did after they took Jerusalem, and this guy called Raymond of Toulouse, who not only says, oh no, we killed them and we did bad things, he actually feels happy that he murdered all those people. So like he says, I mean, I'm quoting from a book, wonderful sights were to be seen. Some of our men cut off the heads of their enemies. Others shot them with arrows so that they fell from towers. Others tortured them longer by casting them into the flames. Piles of heads, hands, and feet were to be seen in the streets of the city. It was a just and splendid judgment of God that this place should be filled with the blood of the unbelievers, since it had suffered so long from their blasphemies. So like, I'm not trying to say like Muslims were not like, were peaceful and like all that stuff, but it's like I think that like most people that like know about this period know about this, or Full Church of Chartres in Gesta Francorum saying like, but one more shall I relate. None of them were left alive. Neither women nor children were spared. So, I mean, like you talk about the ideal of the knight and like all that stuff. Like this is what the knights did when they entered Jerusalem. Sort of like they did murder a lot of people. And like I would have said like, like if they had like been like, okay, this was wrong, right? But they seem to say, no, not only this was not wrong, but it was good that we did this. I think that's where the scandal comes from. I don't know what your thoughts are on this.
I'd say first up, it's not exactly where the scandal comes from. I mean, that's a particular scandal. I'll talk about it. The distaste for the Crusades comes from a general widespread distaste for Christianity and particularly for Catholics and the Middle Ages, and that grows in the Renaissance period, and it's particularly strong amongst Protestants. And then that develops into the more modern kind of secularist and anti-Christian notions. I mean, that's a well-traced intellectual move. I'm just checking my battery life. No, I'll be all right. Intellectual lineage of how we get such a negative aggression and view of the Crusades. But to what you're talking about, you're quoting from those original sources. Raymond of Toulouse was a participant in the First Crusade. Did you quote the Gesta Francorum as well?
Yeah, Gesta Francorum.
Yeah, so you've done well. You've quoted two eyewitness sources. So the Gesta Francorum, this is a bit technical, guys, but the Gesta Francorum, there's arguments about whether it is actually written by a participant or not. But I mean, there's no question that the Siege of Jerusalem is a very horrible end to the Crusades, to the First Crusade. That there was a lot of violence, that there was a certain attitude amongst Crusaders that the killing of people in this manner was a good thing. I mean, it's hard to argue with that, particularly from a modern mindset. The flip side to that is what I did talk about, which in fact, I'll talk about the attitude of Raymond of Toulouse in the last part of this answer. But firstly, I'll also talk about the Western and the general notion of warfare at the time, which continues on for a long period, hundreds and hundreds of years, is the notion of siege and sack. It's pretty shocking to us, but there is an understanding that if you're deciding, an army comes to your gates and they parley, which is they come to a negotiation, which the Crusaders did with the Fatimids. The Fatimids are recorded as just making rude gestures at them and throwing dung at them and things like that and taunting them. But if you operate in that situation to try and avoid a siege, because when a siege happens and you break through, all hell breaks loose. It's pretty much what happens. Now, I'm not defending it, but this is kind of this is how things had operated at the time. We had not, as a race, developed even better formal processes about this. Jerusalem is a great example of kind of the worst version of that. Anybody who knows Henry V might remember the line from the Siege of Harfleur, where Henry V says to the mayor of the city, "Will you yield and this avoid, or guilty in defence be thus destroyed?" So there is a notion that it's actually the fault of if something happens in the siege, it's actually the fault of the people defending, and particularly the leaders defending, for being foolish. Once again, this is more of a contextual understanding. It's not me saying this is the best way to go about things, but it's how they did go about things, and it's within the realm of the time. That's really how sieges operated. In regards to Raymond of Toulouse' comments, now they seem pretty shocking. There is arguments that he's getting a little bit excited, to put it plainly. He's actually referring to a whole variety of eschatological literature, and he's he's being very poetic. Now, once again, it doesn't mean that we're all happy that these kind of things happened, but we can't, what I'm trying to say is we can't just simply open a medieval text and read these things and go, oh, look how horrible they are. They really enjoyed killing women and children. There are, maybe I'll be able to chase up with you afterwards, but there is a number of historical analyses of the writings about the Siege of Jerusalem and the descriptions of the bloodshed and how they're actually poetic, kind of historico-poetic references to eschatological notions. Don't know if that answers the question fully. Not defending the actions of the Crusaders in Jerusalem, but I don't think it's the source of the problem of the Crusades. It is, however, what happens in warfare, and it can be very regrettable.
I've got another question from Matt Hill, and then I think after that, Lucas will go with his question. So we'll go with Matt Hill first.
Hello, can you hear me? I am no relation to this man.
Matt's my brother, by the way.
No relations.
Be really important.
Thanks for the talk, Dan. I have maybe 3 questions you can condense.
I'm only going to do one, Matt.
Well, you can condense them, boy.
Right,
my question is revolving around the holy orders of knights that you mentioned. You mentioned they were warrior monks.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate a bit more on the effects they had, and also how does a monk be both a monk and a warrior? And also, additionally, to get to, are there any good movies about the Crusades?
Okay. There are not many good movies about the Crusades, unless you know some, Matt. I think El Cid's a great old one. It's a bit more the Spanish, the old story of the Spanish fight against the Moors. Kingdom of Heaven is garbage. Good scenery, good, but that's about it. The storyline is bizarre. The Holy Orders are a great example of how a movement like a movement turns into something that's organized and institutionalized. The Crusading becomes institutionalized. A great an example I give is our current medical and hospital system. It's really in charge of our lives even at the moment. So that doesn't just happen overnight. We have centuries and centuries of the development of hospitals, of healthcare, where to start with, it was a bunch of monks who decided to care for people in their monasteries, care for travelers, care for sick travelers, etc., etc. And over the centuries, it ends up with, what I'm under, the Illawarra Shoalhaven local area health network. So these things go from these movements of love and care of neighbour, and they get ingrained in society, and it goes up and down. And some of you know Florence Nightingale and things like that. So anyway, won't go on about healthcare much, but we have military orders of the same thing. So there are some groups who decide to establish themselves as permanent warriors to look after pilgrims, to look after Christians in the Holy Land. And monasteries are and monks are extremely influential, and in the building of medieval and later modern civilization upon that. And they're quite revolutionary. A whole pile of celibate blokes or celibate women getting together, and what do? They invent universities, they invent hospitals, they invent schools, they have all these scientific advancements. I'd have to look up the exact quote, but there's a whole notion. There's quite a famous quote from the early medieval period is, "Oh, look at these monks, you give them a swamp and they'll turn it into a palace." So it's a very interesting idea. And yeah, the warrior monks, as they're known as, the Templars, the Hospitallers, St. John Ambulance, if anyone's ever come across them, they're a branch originally started by Crusaders. So they become institutionalized. Whole long story about them. Some of them go off the rails in the end, like Teutonic Knights. Some of them are later suppressed, but they're very, very wealthy in the end because people trusted them with their protection, and often trusted them with their treasure and money. So you'd have the invention of things like old deposit 1,000 gold coins to the Templars and their castle in England, and I'll withdraw it in Jerusalem. And that's the beginning of international banking, actually. It's just an interesting aside. Hopefully that answers your question, Matt. If not, you can give me a ring and I'll fill you in later any further.
I shall indeed, sir.
Thanks.
Okay, next question, Lucas.
Thanks, Rita. Thanks, Dan, for giving that talk. Thought it was great. Just learned a lot of things that I didn't know before, so that was cool. But I just wanted to, in a way, follow up on Andres' question a little bit. So if a lot of the Crusaders' arguments, or arguments against them rather, was based in saying, look how bad these people were because they did all these bad things. And surely we'd also hear a lot more in the mainstream about, the way that Muslims massacred Christians in in the Eastern Church when they were first expanding, and as they expanded their empires as well. Because even if you're looking at history textbooks in high schools, they'll talk about the bad things that Crusaders did, but not so much for other cultures. So in your opinion, to what extent is anti-Crusader sentiment also just largely motivated by anti-Christian, anti-Catholic sentiment as well?
Look, I'd say near 100%. I mean, Andre's question was excellent. I really liked it because it's really right down to the sources. But when, as I might have mentioned, when we look at general anti-Crusade commentary, it is inextricably linked with anti-Catholic Enlightenment notions, and then of course secularist notions that from our own time that develop out of that. And the idea that that's very common out there are some of those myths that I've said. I mean, hopefully they kind of hit the spot for a lot of you guys who might have heard that or thought that before or were taught that. I mean, there's no evidence for this stuff. What we do have is extreme levels of evidence for consistent atrocity, consistent military attack against Christians for centuries. And we got to realize that, I mean, that happens right up until not far off from the First World War. The Ottoman Empire desiring to conquer Europe. The Ottoman Empire were only stopped at the Siege of Vienna, quite by the help of the Polish troops, stopped at the Siege of Malta. So if those two battles were lost, at the end of this talk, I'll show you a map of what things would look like. So yes, we can argue the nitty-gritty about some of the Crusader atrocities in war. You'd hope that Christians, and particularly in this situation, operate in the highest of virtue. Often they don't. Things happen in war. I'm not trying to flip it away as a nothing, but when we're talking about kind of the meta story here, that's the answer. It is a very selective approach to talking about Christianity, and it comes from a secularist, anti-Catholic sentiment. I've very openly and very kindly had discussions with Muslim friends and colleagues at the University of Sydney about these things, and they've latched on to their views of the Crusades that the secularists have kind of invented, so to speak. But they're not. Oh, there's my brother, Tom. Can you, Tom? But they're invented by a secularist notion. So that's my answer to you. I would say one more thing. I'm not just making this up. I'll see if I've got it somewhere, and if you email me, I can send it to you. There's quite a good study of the attitudes towards the Crusades over history, a synoptic view of how we get to the modern view, or anti-Crusade view. That's a very good one.
Yeah, you kind of answered this, but a brief follow-up would have had was that, especially in in the Anglosphere, throughout the past few hundred, especially in the United States, and with the British Empire versus Spanish, there was a lot of anti-Spanish and therefore anti-Catholic sentiment as well. Do you think that also contributed to the anti-Crusade sentiment?
Yeah, it's all mixed together. I think people like the notion that they can find some example of aggressive Christians being militaristic and invading places and things like that, but it's not really what happened, you know. And yeah, it's like I don't want to make very, very distinct comparisons here, but I will make one that's worth thinking about. And it's been said by very, very highly regarded history professors around the world that there's not much difference between the Crusades and the Allied invasion of Normandy in the Second World War. I mean, it's a totally different period, totally different situation, but the justification for going to war was very, very clear. Yeah.
Cheers, mate. Love your work.
Thanks.
Any other questions? Maybe raise your hand and I can
No more?
Jordan, yeah.
Hey Daniel, I liked your talk, and I just wanted to add on more recently with more scholarship from Arabic and Syriac sources. They've actually
interested in that.
They've come to realize that there were actually periods of coexistence between the Muslims and the Crusaders, and it was actually the Muslims that a lot of radical Muslims that tested the coexistence. But on another note, why did so many indigenous Christians in that region, other than the Maronites and the Armenians, like the Melkites, the Greek Orthodox and the Syriac Orthodox, not really appreciate the efforts of the Crusaders, and really many of them fought against the Crusaders?
The first point's a really good one. Yeah, there are periods of close collaboration between Muslims and Christians throughout history during this period as well. I mean, we or they weren't all fighting all the time in every sphere of the world. I mean, they were fighting all the time somewhere, but yeah, there are many different factions to Islam throughout history, and it's the continuing discovery of sources to add light to the Crusades changes things. I mean, when I was studying the Crusades, the whole relationship, which I'll go on to now, which you mentioned of between the Crusaders and the Byzantines, my supervisors discovered further proof that the Crusaders had actually had formal arrangements with the Byzantine emperor to operate under his kind of headship, which was broken at the Siege of Antioch. So that's just something that happened in a couple of years while I was studying this formally. I always still read things, but look, the whole East and West thing is very unfortunate. I actually the moment is, I think, where it really kind of, from a Crusader Byzantine perspective, it really falls apart. Is the Siege of Antioch. It's very early on in the whole history of the Crusades, but I think it's really unfortunate that happened. But then it also, we have the terrible story of the Crusaders a couple of centuries later conquering Constantinople, and just really going off their heads, to use a Aussie expression. And that's a story for a whole nother day. But as I've said in my discussions about the Siege of Jerusalem, the whole history of the Crusades for 1,000 years, or hundreds of centuries, there are a variety of situations where the Crusaders, for whatever good intentions the whole notion of crusading had, really diverted, made mistakes at best, did very, very, very bad things at worst. And that's just the story of Christian living and Christian history as well. But by and large, it doesn't. But by and large, that doesn't mitigate the fundamental notion of what crusading was. Yeah, but it is unfortunate, the Byzantine and Christian trouble that crusading did end up bringing in the end, because that was not the original intention, but politics gets in the way sometimes. But there are a variety of times during the Crusades and because of where there was formal reunification, but it just never seemed to last. That's and then with the fall of Constantinople, it's always been very difficult.
So I've got one question that someone sent me. How did the Holy Grail tie into the Crusades?
Not much. But it's a very good question though, because kind of we see these days, some of us see this kind of Christian and Catholic notion of relics to be kind of this nice little added extra that is part of our tradition, but you know, we can take it or leave it. That's very different to the first millennia and of even further. It's a very modern Christian notion. Relics are really, really important to Christians all throughout Catholic history. They are venerated in the very, 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 I'm talking first century of Christianity. In fact, a lot of the way we venerate the Eucharist is derived originally from our veneration of relics. It doesn't mean we had different views of the Eucharist. So the whole notion of Christian people, of Christian society, of Christian kind of consecrated buildings and of relics are all really interconnected in the Middle Ages. So you get kind of, not only is it a problem that Christians are not able to go on pilgrimage or worship properly in the Holy Land, that you have a whole, just a fundamental notion, which ties into the first question, but I kind of can't go into it at the time. The fundamental notion that there is a defilement of what is holy that has been going on in the Holy Land. The Holy Land is a living relic, and so relics are very important. If you read the sources of the Crusades, relics appear every 3 pages. So no, the Holy Grail itself is an example of that kind of story and legends that goes on amongst the knightly class in the Middle Ages, but it does reflect a certain attitude that's really important part of their religious experience, and that's part of our heritage as Catholics.